We have Thaddeus on the line. Thaddeus, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi. We're good. How are you?
I am well, thank you. Calling from Springfield, Missouri.
Springfield, Missouri. Welcome.
Okay.
What do you got for us, Thaddeus?
I have a very good friend that I have argued with for the past year or so, ever since I relinquished my faith of Christianity.
Yeah.
I'm now currently an atheist. And this is the one question that I have yet to answer from this person. And she asked me how evolution can explain organ dependency, i.e., if humans need both a heart and a brain, and they can't just have one or the other. And she's asking, did they evolve at the same time? Did they evolve separately? And my explanation to her was, well, somewhere down the line, one of our ancestors had one of those things, and then eventually it evolved to have another, and they became codependent on each other.
Oh, okay. Do you want to take this first, or?
I'm not into science, but I would say it happened very slowly. I know that much. Very
that's
gradual.
That's why I tried to explain that it was over a course of hundreds of millions of years, and she doesn't seem to understand that. Like
the thing is, if you look back at primitive organisms, you don't find like here's a planarian worm, and like this earlier version didn't have any neurons. And then the next version had a brain. It had the ancestry of the brain is simpler and simpler and simpler, smaller, less centrally important versions of the thing that eventually became the brain, right? So these are just systems that evolved in creatures because they needed to do certain jobs, and the earliest creatures didn't need brains. They didn't have them, right?
Well, they have the nucleus, which is like...
The nucleus is not a brain.
Well, it's like the commander of the organs in a cell.
Well, yeah, but that's a nucleus is a thing in a single cell. We're talking about organisms that are multiple cells, right? And as individual cells in a multicellular creature, by evolution, some were better at certain kinds of tasks than others. That became standard for those creatures, and then in further generations, those cells or clusters of cells became better and better through evolution at doing the thing that they were specially purposed for.
Yeah,
right?
She also had and tied to that question, like which came first, the brain or the heart. I told her the brain because I just assumed that since the heart is a blood pumping muscle and our ancestors didn't have. There's
a point before which there isn't even a heart, and you get to simple multicellular creatures. There's a means of moving some fluids around in the brain, these simple creatures that we wouldn't necessarily call a heart. It's the ancestor of the heart. I mean, all these things evolved from cells that were by just normal variation, as many generations of these things were born and died. Individual cells would be better at certain kinds of things, and the ones that had tendencies to produce cells that would have functions that were slightly advantageous, the development of those cells would become more and more common in later generations of that thing, and then they would continue to develop because of the advantage of having specialized cells to do those jobs. And when you go from simple worms to human beings, you're looking at vast amounts of evolutionary time, and we're the end point of that development. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then she also asked, if the ancestors at some point did not have a brain, then what gave them the instinct to reproduce and carry on their genetic information?
A cell that has a biological clock in it that simply does a thing at a certain time in its development, that's not a brain, but it's still doing that thing.
Okay, yeah.
You do not need a brain necessarily to do everything.
Right, there are some animals that don't have a heart or a brain.
Right.
To me, that would counter the argument that you have to have one or the other. I can't.
Well, she was
just-
talking about humans specifically, which I said.
In any case, you're talking to a couple of non-scientists here, right? We're telling you what we understand of evolution, but really,
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
there
but,
are
Dawkins wouldn't
people.
take my Skype call.
There are people who study this stuff and understand it in much greater rigor than we do, and the fact that there are those people that have gone to school and learned and become educated and studied these things, and they are not compelled at all by this woman's arguments, means there's stuff going on that she just doesn't understand.
Well, I was trying to explain it to her. I mean, I know the
Yeah.
answer's out there. I just could not find a good enough one,
Yeah.
that I could explain thoroughly. I get it. Like, something in the back of my head helps me understand it, but I didn't know how to, put it into words. Now, I have another question. Now, less of a question, more like this commentary on a moral precept of the Bible.
Uh-huh.
I can't, I've watched the show for maybe 5 years
Just
now.
a moment. Again, control room. We are getting it sounds like World War II is going on in our headphones.
Yeah, we think that's your caller, but
Okay. Do you have some kind of
Drumming?
war movie or drumming or something
Sounds like a
going on
drum
your
solo.
phone?
Call it.
Thaddeus,
Yeah, I'm still here.
did you have some background noises going on? Because we were hearing it. You typing
No,
or something, maybe?
my room is entirely quiet aside from a fan. I have a fan.
All right. This is a new adventure for us here. We've never broadcast from this room before. All right. So you go on with your question.
Okay, it's more of a commentary on a moral precept that I haven't seen anybody ever address. Slavery is very sanctioned in the Bible. It's explicit how you can go about buying and treating your slaves in the Bible. And then a lot of people will argue, well, they were supposed to treat them nicely. They were supposed to treat with moral indentured servitude. And while that argument falls over on itself most of the time when Matt Dillahunty is talking to them, and he explains that, I found a passage in the Bible sometime back that I think really hammers home that slaves were not people; they were property. In Judges 19:22 through 29, I believe it is, there is an incident where these mob members who are drunk attack this man's home and demand that he give up to them the guest he had in his house so that they could have sex with him, so they could rape him. And the homeowner said, "No, don't do that. That's bad. Instead, you can take my daughter." And then the man protests and he says, "No, don't give up your daughter lest ye be fined. Instead, take my concubine." Okay, so we have three hierarchies here. We have the man, the stranger, who was automatically more valuable than the man's daughter. And then he says, "Lest ye be fined," which implied that, okay, if you give up your daughter, she's going to lose her bride price. She's going to lose the value she has to you. And then instead they gave the concubine up. And once they gave the concubine up, she was raped, and then she died the next morning. And then he cut her up into 12 pieces and sent her out to Israel, which is heinous in and of itself. But that just goes to show that the concubines and the slaves were not people. There was no...
Even if they were, it's almost worse if they are people, because then you're recognizing that these are other human beings, and you're still claiming to own them as property.
But I'm not saying that they weren't people. They were, but they weren't treated as such. They weren't thought of as such. And there was no kindness. There was no how you can say benevolence behind the institution that they had going. If I had to say, I would.
Even if there was, I guess, is the point I'm saying. Even if there was, is slavery okay as long as you treat your slaves nice? No,
not at all.
No,
but
you can't own another human being as property. Now we understand this now because we're socially more advanced than they were.
Don't own other people.
I'm sorry, what?
That's an empathy. If you don't want to be owned, don't own other people.
Yeah.
That's like kind of the root of just about
yeah, but
every
it's not.
precept.
It's not like people back then didn't have empathy. So I wouldn't be surprised if we could travel back in time in a machine, right, to visit some household that had slaves and find those slaves being treated well because those people had empathy too. What they did not have is an understanding of the need for equal rights for people.
Well, at the same token,
they did not
certain
have
degrees
that.
of empathy are taught, so therefore, a child
Sure.
is raised in a certain household, whether he's taught or he or she's taught their entire time one certain value, they're bound to just assume that value to be authoritatively true.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I forgot what I was going to say about this. No, there's the argument of are good things good because God does them, or does God do things because they are good? And a lot of people will argue that things are good because God does them, and because of that, they try to find the benevolence behind certain heinous institutions that you find in the Bible. Slavery, the sex trade, pillaging people, and it's this really, really heinous way of trying to justify something.
I
But
agree.
that's why they do that. Regardless of whether it's good or not, they try to find some sliver of benevolence, or try to use some sort of equivocation in order to justify the slavery. But I feel that passage sort of demolishes any argument that they could have ever made or will make.
Yeah, it's a bit two-faced of them to try to do that, because they're arguing that things God does are good by definition. But they know that's not enough, and so then they look around for excuses to try to say these things are actually good by, when you analyze them. That shouldn't be necessary if they really believe that because God did it is the only justification needed to say that it was good.
Yeah, that also destroys subjective morality, because then good and bad are just completely arbitrary.
Yeah.
And if God raped a baby, then that would be good.
Yeah. Joe?
Even though,
Have anything to chime in
That
on
is
this
a
one?
quandary I love to explore and to explain to people, that if God sets morals, then just anything he wants to do is suddenly moral. And we can read the Bible about how he did terribly depraved, horrible things, killing lots of people for no good reasons. If that's morality, then the rest of the Bible has to be consumed with an attempt to try to reverse that. And I think Jesus was a very revolutionary part of the Bible. One reason was because that whole book is filled with nothing but people doing things without empathy. And so when Jesus came along and tried to introduce that, along with some rather sadistic ideas as well, it is a shock to the reader. And I think a lot of modern Christians look at that and say, Jesus came to fix the Bible, not just the way people are. But you could read the New Testament, and there is that portion towards the end of the book where finally there's some empathy introduced to that religion. And I find it just amazing, though, that, it's understandable that empathy would come later, after self-serving attitudes that are evolutionarily necessary for survival would slowly taper off as we become more evolved socially, and be replaced by empathy and a more organized sense of empathy. But religion keeps that Bible around, and other books like it, which continue to hold on to the primitive ideas that don't involve empathy. And that can be a real drag on social evolution with some groups and some locations to this day.
Yeah, I hope nobody would take this seriously and try it, but I think a much more compelling and rational religion could be formed out of taking the Bible and changing the premise from, if the Bible is the story of God trying to make people be good, and flip that around and say, the Bible is the story of people trying to make God good.
Yes.
That makes a lot more sense. If there were congregations meeting, imagining there's this big entity in the sky that needs to be taught the difference between right and wrong, and our job down here is to teach him that, a lot of the Bible would make a lot more sense.
Yeah. On that slavery note, I constantly hear when Matt's arguing, people will try to flip it back on him. Well, what does evolution say about slavery, or some retarded straw man like that? I think that it actually does kind of nullify slavery, because one of the pillars of natural selection, is safety in numbers. Species try to bond together to preserve themselves. So owning each other and treating each other, terribly is not going to get you very far.
Yeah, I wouldn't try to latch on to evolution as a source of moral guidance, particularly, because evolution is not about that. Evolution is a fact, right? And it establishes, an understanding, describes what's actually going on. That doesn't mean that we should behave in certain ways because of what evolution does. The reason why we need equal rights for human beings is because we've tried it the other way, and look at what those societies were like.
Yeah, they were very
it's not really. I wouldn't really go to evolution to try to justify that.
Well,
a lot of horrific things happen within the bounds of evolution, right? I mean, So
Do what?
a lot of horrific things happen within the bounds of evolution.
Yeah, natural selection is fully tyrannical.
Yeah, yeah. We don't want to be living as if. I mean, that's that's libertarianism. All right.
Okay.
So, anything else, Thaddeus?
Nope, that'll be it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm sorry. That was a personal comment on libertarianism. The ACA is not politically biased.
I didn't think it was.
Just me. Okay. Thanks for your call.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah. Everybody wants there to be some clear, easy thing to point at and say, that there, if we study that, then we'll understand how we should behave. But the real world is complicated, and relationships between human beings are complicated, and there is such a thing as they're telling me there's more calls up. There is such a thing as tragedy, situations where there's no good answer to certain kinds of situations. So I think that the quest for a perfect set of moral guidance, of moral rules, is probably a mistake. But constant striving is not a mistake.
There you go.